A free coffee is never just a simple morning greeting. It is a silent, binding contract drafted in the ink of obligation. A debt they never asked to sign. The unsolicited rescuer arrives not merely to help, but to expertly plant the invisible seeds of a profound emotional imbalance, cultivating heavy leverage in plain sight. They target the overwhelmed and the utterly exhausted, exploiting the vulnerability of a chaotic desk to drop an anchor of manufactured kindness, paralyzing the prey with toxic gratitude. Look closely at the subtle transaction unfolding. A seemingly harmless object instantly becomes a psychological Trojan horse designed for invasion, carrying the crushing weight of a future demand. True generosity leaves no lingering dark shadow behind. But this calculated offering casts a suffocating web across the sterile corporate environment, tightly tethering the victim to their new savior. With every single drop consumed in blind ignorance, the internal ledger begins to actively record a heavy and dangerous deficit, a deficit that demands an ultimate, painful repayment. The asymmetrical smile reveals absolutely nothing of the trap. It merely serves as a comforting mask to lower all natural defenses, while the predator patiently prepares the snare. Human evolution has brutally hardwired the mammalian brain to feel an agonizing dissonance when a gift remains completely unreturned, smoothly weaponizing our very own moral compass. A single dollar spent on a trivial distraction buys an immeasurable amount of psychological real estate within an anxious human mind. A terrifyingly high return on investment. Another small favor effortlessly drops right into place, layering microscopic debts until the fragile foundation of independence completely fractures, leaving only desperate, blind compliance behind. The whispered words of gratitude permanently seal the pact, locking the unaware individual inside an invisible and suffocating prison of their own conscience, slowly draining their free will. They casually dismiss the immense effort freely given, creating a dangerous illusion of unconditional support that perfectly blinds the logical mind, hiding the razor blade within the sweet candy. Time silently ferments the tiny initial favor offered, expanding the psychological burden until it rapidly mutates into an unbearable, crushing pressure, ready to be forcefully collected. The sterile corporate labyrinth watches without speaking a word, as another naive soul unwittingly swallows the toxic bait whole and intact, stepping blindly into the psychological slaughterhouse. Kindness with a hidden receipt is merely a predatory transaction. Every kind gesture is silently recorded, meticulously entered into an invisible ledger kept locked inside their calculating mind, a record of debts yet unpaid. The ledger keeper never demands immediate repayment, choosing instead to let the psychological interest compound steadily over countless trivial interactions, building a massive invisible fortune. A dropped pen casually retrieved from the floor transforms instantly from a simple courtesy into a heavily weighted psychological transaction, adding another heavy tally mark. They offer small compliments wrapped in thick deception, strategically targeting the exact insecurities of the exhausted worker to ensure maximum emotional dependency, sinking the hooks even deeper. Notice how the predator maintains absolute emotional detachment, while actively forcing the desperate target to invest heavily in the fabricated illusion of friendship, a completely one-sided emotional economy. The human conscience acts as the perfect enforcer, ruthlessly punishing the victim for feeling suspicious about such a seemingly benevolent and supportive colleague, locking the trap from the inside. They share a seemingly harmless piece of office gossip, offering this tiny fragment of intimacy strictly as a carefully calculated psychological investment, waiting for a lucrative return. The physical workspace slowly morphs into a battlefield, where every single red object serves as a glaring reminder of a small favor owed, suffocating the victim with manufactured guilt. To the outside world, they look like absolute saints, tirelessly supporting their struggling peers without ever asking for a single thing in return. the perfect camouflage for a parasite. But a true saint does not keep a scorecard, nor do they smile that chillingly empty smile when their target looks away in absolute exhaustion. A predator always calculates its meal. The ledger grows heavier with every passing afternoon, filling up with unsolicited document edits and coffees that burn the throat with pure obligation, an inescapable labyrinth of minor debts. The victim begins to actively anticipate the next favor, trapped in a vicious cycle of receiving and agonizing over how they will ever manage to repay, the mind fracturing under pressure. They try to refuse the next seemingly harmless offer, but the manipulator skillfully deflects the rejection with a devastating display of feigned and exaggerated hurt, weaponizing their own fabricated vulnerability. The unwritten contract becomes utterly impossible to legally cancel, bound entirely by the fragile human desire to be perceived as a fundamentally good person, the ultimate weakness exploited. Welcome to the dark architecture of the invisible ledger, where every kind act is a heavily weighted brick violently thrown into the wall of your new prison. Tiny favors build a mountain of guilt, growing silently until it is too late, an avalanche triggered by a simple smile. They constantly interrupt the victim's frantic workflow, offering a snack to break their focus, manufacturing a profound state of pure dependency. Every single unrequested act of daily assistance acts as a small dose of poison, slowly freezing the logical defensive instincts entirely. The overwhelmed target desperately tries to decline, forcing the red gift directly upon them, sealing the next invisible microtransaction permanently. Notice how the predator actively creates artificial problems, only to step in and help them, playing both the villain and the ultimate savior. The psychological weight of these tiny daily interactions begins to crush the deeply exhausted victim, stealing the very air they desperately need to breathe. A simple act of taking out the trash is weaponized to build a dark monument, demanding immediate silent worship and total, absolute submission. They hover constantly near the exhausted, anxious worker, offering advice that heavily undermines their competence, breeding a deep and incredibly lasting self-doubt. The human brain simply cannot efficiently process today such a rapid onslaught of manipulative behaviors, leading to total cognitive and absolute emotional collapse. The victim feels profoundly ungrateful and entirely selfish for resisting the person who helps them, the mental dissonance slowly tearing their fragile sanity. Every single brightly colored sticky note left behind acts as a heavy iron chain link, dragging the broken prey deeper into blind compliance. They cleverly mask their aggressive, dark, territorial expansion under the guise of being supportive peers, leaving the trapped victim absolutely no escape route. The desk is no longer a personal workspace, becoming a territory conquered by the parasite, marked by vivid red flags of rising debt. The internal scale of absolute mental emotional justice is forever tipped toward the smiling predator, a rigged corporate game from the very start. 1,000 tiny cuts will drain the soul. They listen to mirror your weaknesses, carefully absorbing every painful detail shared, weaving a tight emotional snare. The illusion of shared struggle is a potent weapon, disarming the deeply isolated worker entirely, forcing a dangerous premature trust. They invite the target to complain freely about work, actively gathering valuable and sensitive psychological ammunition, preparing for the inevitable future betrayal. Notice how the predator perfectly mimics the victim's pain, projecting a flawless mirrored emotional reflection effortlessly, ensuring deep psychological resonance and compliance. A shared secret feels like a solid protective fortress, but it is merely an open cage, waiting for the heavy lock to snap. They artificially lower their own professional and personal boundaries, inviting the desperate, helpless prey to follow, stepping into the dark psychological quicksand. Empathy without true, genuine, vulnerable human compassion and connection is nothing but a chilling interrogation tactic, extracting vital data disguised as deep care. The exhausted worker confesses their profound and hidden fears, freely handing over the literal butcher knife, exposing the softest, vulnerable psychological underbelly. This toxic bonding rapidly accelerates the deep trauma connection, violently merging the predator and helpless prey, blurring all critical and safe defensive lines. They offer a seemingly safe and warm emotional harbor, while quietly and slowly poisoning the water, making the desperate victim sick with dependency. The manipulator selectively reveals carefully fabricated personal tragic flaws, creating a powerful dark illusion of vulnerability, hacking the basic human need for connection. Every whispered confidence acts as a heavy, invisible tether, violently dragging the target from safe reality, isolating them within a dark, distorted mirror. They validate the target's darkest and most paranoid suspicions, artificially amplifying the deep internal workplace anxiety, ensuring they remain the only safe refuge. The psychological boundary lines dissolve into a black void, leaving the naked, terrified mind completely exposed. A perfect, fragile target for ultimate exploitation. An understanding nod hides a very calculating smirk. When the exhausted worker finally attempts to set a boundary, the manipulator executes a sudden emotional reversal, instantly playing the deeply wounded victim. Any minor act of self-preservation is quickly twisted into a brutal and unprovoked personal attack, punishing the target for seeking space. The predator expertly utilizes defensive tears and subtle sighs, shifting the heavy burden of intense guilt, forcing the prey to apologize immediately. A perfectly timed display of fragile and fabricated vulnerability disarms the completely rational and logical mind, turning rightful anger into deep regret. Notice how the conversation violently pivots away from accountability, focusing entirely on their manufactured emotional pain, leaving the real issue completely unresolved. They weaponize their past favors as a heavy shield, deflecting any reasonable and necessary professional criticism, reminding the victim of their debt. The sudden cold silence becomes a suffocating invisible punishment, draining the deeply anxious and exhausted target, demanding a complete and total surrender. This carefully orchestrated theatrical performance of profound emotional injury neutralizes the very first signs of rebellion, pulling the tight leash back firmly. The target is aggressively forced to comfort the abuser, abandoning their own valid and desperate boundaries, stepping back into the dark cage. An inverted reality is meticulously constructed within the workplace, where the parasite demands constant soothing sympathy, blinding everyone to the true dynamic. The surrounding colleagues blindly rush to support the manipulator, isolating the true victim in absolute silence, turning the whole office against them. Every single attempt to explain the true underlying toxicity paints the desperate target as incredibly ungrateful, cementing the flawless illusion of sainthood. The emotional ledger is aggressively rewritten during this conflict, erasing the massive psychological toll completely overnight, resetting the dangerous trap once again. A calculated retreat ensures the victim feels deeply abandoned, triggering their profound fear of total isolation, forcing them to beg for peace. The predator's tears are forged to drown their prey. The small seeds yield a devastating harvest, as the predator finally reveals their intent, presenting the ultimate heavy psychological bill. Months of tiny calculated micro-favors manifest into a sudden crushing heavy demand, forcing a massive and painful sacrifice. They frame the monumental and dangerous request merely as a tiny, insignificant reciprocal gesture, completely distorting the scales of fairness. The exhausted victim feels the dark trap snap, paralyzed entirely by the overwhelming heavy weight, suffocating under the fake debt. Notice how the predator strikes at the perfect time, when the target is completely drained, maximizing the dark psychological leverage. A simple coffee bought 3 months ago is violently traded for absolute professional sabotage, a terrifyingly high investment return. The target hesitates to accept the crushing burden, but the manipulator perfectly mirrors absolute desperation, weaponizing their fabricated and false vulnerability. Refusing the massive and very dangerous request feels like committing an unforgivable moral crime, breaking the sacred unspoken human contract. The predator assures it is a one-time thing, pouring sweet, toxic honey into the ear, masking the razor-sharp edge of the blade. Logic violently screams against the destructive choice, but the heavy conditioned guilt quietly obeys, dragging them into the dark abyss. They demand the victim cover up a massive critical error, risking their entire career for a parasite, the ultimate extraction of pure psychological energy. The asymmetrical smile returns to the shadowed face as the trapped prey quietly nods defeat, signing the final fatal dark contract. The environment visually warps and completely bends inward, mirroring the profound internal collapse of reality, an inescapable geometric prison of absolute obligation. 1,000 tiny threads weave a heavy rope, securely tightening around the victim's fragile neck, leaving zero room to breathe. The final invoice is always paid in dark blood. Logic screams out against the trap, but the heavy conditioned conscience silently obeys, surrendering entirely to the dark illusion. The victim tries to rationalize the abuse, convincing themselves that this is completely normal, actively protecting the smiling predator. Cognitive dissonance shatters the fragile human mind, forcing the victim to rewrite their reality, creating a desperate false peace. They desperately search for a valid escape, only to find the heavy doors locked, trapped by their own morality. Notice how the abuser remains perfectly calm, watching the target self-destruct from afar, enjoying the total emotional control. Every logical warning sign is actively suppressed, buried deep beneath the heavy, toxic guilt, crushing the vital survival instinct. The psychological tension reaches an unbearable breaking point, forcing the exhausted mind to completely submit, accepting the terrible new reality. A deep feeling of profound internal betrayal slowly poisons their own basic self-respect, leaving only a hollow, empty shell. They become an active accomplice in their destruction, willingly handing over the vital survival key, trading freedom for fake harmony. The invisible chains are incredibly strong today, forged purely from their own good intentions. The ultimate and darkest psychological irony. The corporate labyrinth actively encourages this dark sacrifice, rewarding the brutal parasite and punishing them, maintaining the cold, systemic abuse. The target looks into the broken dark mirror, unable to recognize the terrified face reflecting a stranger in their body. Their moral compass spins in absolute blinding chaos, completely losing the crucial direction to safety, drowning in the dark confusion. The manipulator smoothly consolidates their new dark power, securing the final massive emotional mental extraction, bleeding the dry victim completely. A mind at war with itself will burn. The invisible strings pull tighter in the dark, wrapping around the isolated victim silently, ensuring absolute total compliance. They systematically sever every single healthy connection, leaving the exhausted worker entirely alone, completely dependent on their abuser. A fabricated rumor acts as a sharp blade, cutting through the last remaining friendships, bleeding the victim completely dry. The surrounding office environment grows colder daily, freezing out the desperately helpless target, sealing the invisible psychological tomb. Notice how the predator actively blocks external support, intercepting every single lifeline thrown down, ensuring total drowning in guilt. The victim begins to actively avoid other colleagues, hiding their profound and heavy shame, fading into a silent ghost. The once vibrant workspace becomes a barren wasteland, stripped of every single safe refuge, leaving nowhere left to hide. The heavy burden of the unpayable emotional debt forces a deep and crippling silence, silencing the internal survival alarm. They watch the predator effortlessly charm new victims, realizing the terrifying cycle never ends, trapped in a dark loop. Any cry for help is expertly intercepted immediately, twisted into proof of mental instability, discrediting the target permanently now. The parasite actively feeds on this profound isolation, growing stronger with every single tier, expanding their dark territorial control. A psychological quarantine is brutally and strictly enforced, locking the victim inside their mind, a prison without physical walls. The stark white office lights feel violently oppressive, exposing the naked terror perfectly now, leaving zero protective shadows left. The target completely surrenders to the total void, accepting their role as permanent prey. A broken spirit, fully consumed. Silence is the heaviest chain of all. Under the carefully constructed smiling mask, the predator finally reveals their true nature, an endless void of calculation. The meticulous ledger of tiny favors was never about building genuine human connections, merely expanding their dark territorial web. They study normal human empathy deeply, only to mimic the complex emotional language, a hollow and perfectly rehearsed performance. Notice how their chilling asymmetrical smile drops the absolute second nobody is watching, revealing the cold, dead machine underneath. The red coffee cup was a hook, perfectly designed to snare a vulnerable mind, sinking deep into the exhausted soul. They do not feel actual, genuine compassion. They only understand psychological leverage and control, treating human beings as disposable assets. The victim was never truly a friend, just another calculated entry in the ledger, a battery drained of useful energy. When the psychological extraction is completely finished, the parasite simply discards the broken shell, moving smoothly to the next target. They leave behind a devastated emotional landscape while maintaining their flawless, saintly corporate reputation. The perfect and untouchable invisible crime. Every single act of unprompted office kindness must now be heavily scrutinized and questioned. Trust is replaced by paranoid survival. The manipulator walks the stark, sterile halls, searching actively for the next exhausted victim, carrying another fake cup of poison. Look closely at the eyes of the predator, reflecting absolutely nothing but cold, dark ambition, a mirror devoid of human warmth. They thrive in the toxic corporate labyrinth because the broken system rewards their cruelty, elevating the most ruthless, quiet sociopaths. The mask of the unsolicited kind rescuer is the most dangerous disguise ever invented, hacking the deepest parts of humanity. A wolf wearing the wool of compassion. The crushing reality of the workplace finally settles upon the broken victim, sealing their dark and permanent fate. True kindness requires absolutely zero ledgers, but this corporate parasite keeps receipts, demanding painful payment for every smile. They weaponize the fundamental human conscience, turning empathy into a heavy chain, binding the target to their desk. The exhausted worker now completely understands that the free coffee was poison, a bitter draft of endless debt. Notice how the corporate machine applauds, rewarding the sociopath for their efficiency, ignoring the crushed souls left behind. The perfectly tailored suit remains spotless, hiding the massive psychological carnage underneath, the invisible blood of the innocent. Every future favor offered by anyone will trigger a deep survival instinct, forever staining the concept of trust. The victim stares at their hands, realizing they built their own prison, brick by brick, with fake gratitude. The manipulator simply adjusts their tie, looking outward for the next target, repeating the endless cycle of extraction. An office built on hidden transactions is merely a slaughterhouse with cubicles, where empathy goes to quietly die. They traded temporary relief for freedom, handing over the keys to sanity, a devastating psychological return on investment. The invisible ledger is finally balanced, paid entirely in fear and submission, the ultimate dark corporate currency collected. Do not trust the unearned favor, because the smiling angel wants payment, ready to collect your very soul. The stark geometric shadows stretch endlessly, swallowing the fragile white light completely, ending the silent and bitter war. A fake favor is an ambush,